Welcome to RougeRadio.com, the CIS podcast. I'm Kevin Garbuio, joined again this week by Donnovan and Bennett. Thanks for joining us, Donnovan.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Well, this week we talked about how the Montreal-Laval game, the home and home set, how this was a big chance for the Montreal Carabin to take over top spot, get a really nice chance at hosting a Dunsmore Cup match. What happened this week?
Yeah, it was the premier game, as you mentioned, this week. It was very fitting that it was on a Sunday because a lot of CIS fans weren't watching, the NFL games or the Red Zone channel. They were, tuning in to Radio Canada to see, which Laval team would show up, number one, and how far has the Carabin program come. And we got a resounding answer that, Laval, they may have slipped from their ridiculously high standard, but since they've made some changes on their offensive staff, they're explosive on both sides of the ball. Once again, it was a complete performance for them. Their offense was, very hit or miss, but they were able to get explosive plays. And, when you only have 14 first downs, but yet you're able to garner 30 points, that means that your kicking game is well, and when you are in the area to get points, you're getting them. And Boris Bede is one of the best kickers in the country with a strong leg. And their offense doesn't have to be McMaster's. With a great defense, a defense that's going to get you points with field position and, forcing safeties and also forcing turnovers, your offense just has to be the reason as to not lose you games. And you play to your strength. They've got a great defense. They've got a great kicker and great special teams. And now that offense is starting to catch up, starting to sit at the head of the table and say, you know what, we are going to be not just along for the ride, we're going to help propel this team. What could be a long ride and could end them in Toronto and playing in the Vanier. The question is now, when these teams face off in Montreal, is it the same Laval team? Because, especially offensive players, I think defense travels. You play good defense, you play good defense anywhere. Offensive players with, the fans cheering for them and getting them excited and understanding the footing of your field and how it's different than other places. I think offense really gets a bigger boost from playing at home, and how Laval, who's a different team at PEPS, how they bring their game to the road and to Montreal will be pretty telling, because historically the Carabin have never played well at PEPS. Really, no one has. When Montreal-Laval games have been close, it was in Montreal. So we've seen the first chapter. I'm interested to see the response now from Danny Machoch's boys.
Well, the response will have to be next week, and with the tiebreak, we assume that Laval and Montreal, say Montreal wins again, they finish with the same record. It's going to come down to points for and against each other. Montreal is going to have to beat Laval by at least 20 points to get to get that home field advantage. Do you see that happening? A team putting up 20 points against Laval at this stage of the season?
No, and this is the issue. You make a great point about not even forget about putting up 20 points. They're talking about having a win margin that's, in the higher double digits. And Montreal's formula for success is running the football, which, obviously drains the clock. And they weren't able to run it well against Laval. Rochan Sene, only 62 yards, and the more telling thing is the average of 3.3. When offensively they're not putting themselves in second and short, second and manageable situations, that takes them out of their comfort zone and then allows that great Laval pass rush to pin their ears back and get after the passer. And I think that's the issue for them is they're even on their best days, their formula is not to throw the ball all around the park and be explosive. Their formula is to reverse pivot and hand off to one of the best running backs in the country. So a formula for them to be successful and win, still in doing that, the margin of victory, probably would have been closer. Montreal wants to make this a physical, ground and pound, bleed the clock out football game. Laval wants to make it an explosive game and let their talented skill players on both sides of the ball, show their talents. So it's a tough ask. Not only it's hard enough to beat this team, but to beat them by that margin, it's asking Montreal to get out of how they play, what they do best.
Yeah, they're going to have to open up the game, and it'll be an entirely different game plan probably in this game. It's nice that they scored the touchdown and got 10 points in the fourth quarter to close it up, almost like in soccer when you're just trying to get that goal to skew the aggregate number. But it's going to be very interesting to see what happens this week. Other big news coming out of Quebec, this affecting two conferences. Rumors swirling out of Montreal, first reported by Mo Khan of TSN 690 out of Montreal. He's saying that Concordia might have two ineligible players, maybe one at the least. What's going on with that? What can you shed some light for us?
Well, I mean, what this does now is, I mean, Concordia, first of all, it's a good thing that they caught it, now. It would obviously been a lot better to have caught this, earlier in the season. But now their playoff hopes and aspirations are in serious jeopardy, but really it affects not just them, but the rest of the competitive balance in not just Quebec, but also in the AUS, because they went out and they beat St. FX by 21 points. Now that turns into a victory for St. FX, but more importantly, it takes off that minus 21 for St. FX. So that now changes the balance of power in the AUS, where obviously Acadia is by far and away the best team, but you've got a fight for who's going to finish second, who's going to finish third, who's going to have that bye in the first round or make the playoffs out of the AUS. So if I'm Mount Allison or if I'm St. Mary's specifically, who's at 2-3, now might be tied with St. FX after comfortably being in second place and feeling good about their efforts. I'm sort of feeling hard done by, because the random chance of scheduling of when Concordia happened to play St. FX now affects the balance of power moving forward. And in a 4-team conference, the balance of power and adding a win and skewing the plus-minus is a big deal. And, to the same extent, the same can be said in the RSCQ. Bishops now is going to pick up another win, and now if you're Sherbrooke, you're saying we're potentially going to be tied with Bishops going down the home stretch when we've been a better team throughout the year, and they're getting a victory that they obviously didn't earn on the field. So it's unfortunate, and the thing that boggles my mind and drives me crazy. It's like it seems like every year over the last couple of years something like this happens. Last year it was Laurier. There's some issues with the 5 and 7 rule and how it's interpreted and who was grandfathered in. And Montoya was deemed ineligible, so they had a big blowout victory over Toronto, which ended up being a loss, and that changed some playoff implications, and they had to start their playoff journey on the road. So I could be crazy, but I just don't see this issue happening as much. One, in other sports in the CIS, but two, in the NCAA, and I think the individual schools have to take a greater time and appreciation on compliance. And for the most part, it's just at the beginning of the year, during training camp, there's a seminar where people are told the rules and asked to fill out a sheet so that the compliance officers can look it over, but that's done really when guys have earbuds in their headphones and some guys are fast asleep. It's not seen as a priority. It's just seen as a due diligence task. Well, not enough due diligence has been done, and unfortunately, it seems like year after year, the competitive balance of serious programs has been put in jeopardy because teams are forced to forfeit games.
Yeah, I agree completely. Look at UBC right now. They're the way if the season ends today, they're 2 years without a win because of that ineligible player last year. So with these ineligible players and continuing popping up, it seems like more due diligence is needed. We'll get more information out this week. Some people might be thinking that it might be a blacklisted player from from CEGEP who didn't require enough credits when he went. It didn't acquire enough credits when he entered. at Concordia. But it's really a shame for the Stingers, who did have playoff aspirations this year, to go down because someone didn't dot their I's or cross their T's.
Yeah, and it hurts the program because obviously those playoff aspirations are now all but finished. But for a program that's in the transformative years and trying to move up the ladder in the queue, part of luring potential recruits is saying, hey, listen, we're chopping at the wood, we're getting closer and closer, narrowing that gap, and we just need player X or B or C to come to our program to help us get over the top. Well, despite the reason, when you don't make the playoffs, when you're not being seen playing meaningful games on national TV in late October and possibly November, it's hard to draw the attention of some of those players. So it really hurts them, not just this year, but I think it hurts them moving forward. And I know it's a black or white issue, but I just think when these decisions have such gravity, we kind of need to have a common sense rule of who is the player, why was he ineligible, was it something that a team was trying to hide, or was it just a clerical mistake, and did that player affect the game? And it's a difference if a guy was running down on special teams as a contained player, or if a guy touched the ball in every play and was the starting quarterback. And we should have a common sense rule about how we deliver these penalties, because there are grave consequences when we do.
Yeah, I agree completely. And moving forward now, we'll go into the OUA, discussing some teams on the rise. As you mentioned, Concordia trying to become a team on the rise. Last week you said Guelph is the team on the rise in the OUA. Take us through that game. What a thriller. And at the TD Waterhouse Stadium in Western, you were there to see it. Tell us about this one.
Well, to really analyze this game, you got to move, a week prior from a Western perspective. You lose Donnie Marshall at homecoming for the second year in a row. Great injury, great loss to the team, but you got a great backup in Will Finch. Then you find out the news on Monday. He needs an emergency surgery to remove his appendix. His availability is in doubt for that week, but you're just really hoping that he's healthy, because that's quite the scare. So then you move to your backup, Huggins, who is the starting quarterback for your junior affiliate team, the London Beefeaters, and he now has to make a decision of whether he's going to play on Saturday in his first ever CIS start for the Western Mustangs, or play his semifinal in Ontario for the Beefeaters, a team that he's been the starting quarterback of all year. If he plays, obviously he's ineligible to move on with the Beefeaters. So you're waiting for that decision, or you're maybe turning to your fourth stringer, Stevenson Bone, who's the son of Jamie Bone, a former Heck Crichton quarterback at the University of Western Ontario. So with all that, you finally are able to dress Finch and Huggins, and the inability for both of them to practice with a first-team offense for the better part of a week, both of them getting their first real snaps in meaningful games against a tough front seven, one of the best front sevens in the country, and a secondary that has some holes, but they're able to gamble because the front seven creates so much pressure and really just so much havoc. And what happened is Guelph got on them early, and they got after them, and they turned over the ball and got 4 interceptions early in the game. But more importantly, when they had a short field, because of those interceptions, they capitalized and they turned it into points, and they got up 30-7 in the first half, and Western just looking to run out the clock. San Vito, who was the best player on the field, tried to make not just a good play, but a great play in reversed field, trying to score, and fumbled. Guelph, give them credit, took the points, and their great kicker, Julian Chapea, took basically 3 free points before the half, and those 3 points ended up being the difference in the game, as Guelph held off a furious comeback by Western in the second half to win by 3 on another late kick by Chapea. So you've got two things here. Western with not a lot of continuity on offense as far as their quarterback's concerned, and Guelph, a team on the rise, and a team who, in future years, if they got up big and a team stormed back on them and took the lead, they would fold. But now Stu Lang has his program at a point where they just compete. They compete on every play, and competition doesn't waver on what the score is, whether you're up by a lot or down by a lot. If you're competing, that's it. It's non-negotiable. You're competing on every play, and that's why, despite the fact that Western stormed back and got back into the football game, they were able to continue to compete, fight, and end up getting a victory. In their locker room for the past year, they had a sign that said, "Beat Western," with a time clock running down to the start of the kickoff of this game. They had it in their mind as a goal. They competed, and they got it done. A lot of people don't give Guelph credit because they look at the score sheet and they say, they don't win by a lot, they don't blow teams out. Well, that's their formula for success. They've got one of the best running backs in the country in Farquharson. They run the ball, they play tough, stout defense, they play a field position game, and they trust that their kickers can make kicks late in games, and their quarterback, Jazz Lindsay, can put them in good spots offensively late in games. And that formula was tried and tested and true this week. Now, they're on everyone's radar. They're not sneaking up on anyone. They've got another great team coming in Queens, and this one is for home field in the first round of the OUA playoffs. A home date in the semifinals and a nice bye in the first round would go a long way, and more importantly, making sure you stay away from the Marauders until possibly the Yates Cup would go a long way as well. So it looks like we're going to have another great football game in Guelph, Ontario this week.
Well, that'll be very exciting, and that, I believe, is a game on the University Rush this week.
No, it's actually we are going to be in Hamilton this week for McMaster's homecoming as Windsor, another team with playoff aspirations and fighting for playoff seeding, travels down the 401 to Mac. And this one will be a display of two of the most elite quarterbacks in the country, Austin Kennedy, who for my money was the second best quarterback in the country last year, and I felt should have been a real heck nominee once Kyle Quinlan was suspended for a couple games. And obviously the guy who is the prohibitive favorite to win the Heck Right in this year, Kyle Quinlan, both of them coming out of the Windsor area in the same Essex Ravens football program, and they're both pretty special athletes. I'm looking forward to seeing them go head-to-head this week.
Well, both players are going neck and neck right now for the yards totals and for passing, not just in the OUA but for the CIS. Also, McMaster hosting Windsor. Windsor struggling last week against Queens at times, but if Windsor could get an upset here, this would be something to build towards, especially going forward, as this is another program on the rise. It seems like we have a lot of programs on the rise in the OUA right now, and we have the two teams that are the stalwarts right now, McMaster, Queens. Then you have Windsor and Guelph, who are looking to become those upper echelon teams. This could be the semifinal for the Yates Cup.
Yeah, and Windsor is kind of going through that sophomore. I don't want to say slump because they're still going to make the playoffs and have something to say with who wins the Yates Cup. But it's different. Where last year they had a new coach who was really the interim at that point. Not a lot of expectations, and they snuck up on some teams and maybe stole some victories. Now everyone is well aware when Windsor is on your schedule, it's going to be a dogfight, and they're preparing as such. So now Windsor struggled to beat the upper echelon teams in the conference, although they've played them tough. They played Western relatively tough. They did some good things against Queens defensively early and offensively late. The game with Guelph was relatively close until the second quarter. They haven't been able to beat those upper echelon elite teams. They beat who they were supposed to beat, and they beat them quite badly, but in those games where every mistake costs for that much more, they haven't been able to be error-free. So this will be a great dress rehearsal, not just to see how far they've come, but also for them, once you get into the playoffs in the OUA, the top five teams, outside of, as you mentioned, Mac and Queens being on that next level. When you look at the Westerns and the Guelphs, and even if Laurier sneaks into the playoffs, there's a lot of parity there. So you're going to have to win a couple tough games, definitely a game or two on the road, if you want to be playing deep into November. So this is a great dress rehearsal for them, because they're going to see games like this, they're going to see environments like this as they go to McMaster's Homecoming moving forward. And they lost some great players in Seamus Posma on the defensive line, and Corey Fernandez was one of their great receivers, and they've had some injuries to key players with McGarva, their great safety, being hurt. So now they have to really show the national viewing audience, who are you, Windsor? Are you still a couple years away, or are you just knocking on the door and possibly ready to break it down right now?
Yeah, and it could be a chance for Austin Kennedy to get his name out there, start getting noticed on the national scene. This year, obviously, not much of a chance for the Heck Creighton because of who's on the other sideline next week, but it'd be nice to see start getting a body of work going for him as he moves forward in his OUA career and his CIS career.
Yeah, I mean, outside of, Eric Lavich, for me, historically, when you look at who's won it and how the voting has gone, the Heck Creighton is a award that you don't win necessarily in 1 year. You win it in 2 and 3 years, and you start making a case, and then when the narrative is there and you're close to the end of your career or your team is championship worthy, then you get the nod. And you'll just look at Cal Quinlan. He's played at a high level for a couple of years, but there are guys, ahead of him maybe in that progression, like a Sinopoli, who, voters, tended to lean towards because the narrative was in their favor at the time. They were leading a high-level program. So I think Austin Kennedy is putting a resume together where, once Kyle Quinlan's eligibility is exhausted, now I'm stepped to the forefront as one of the premier candidates for the Heck Creighton moving forward, along with a guy like Garrett Sanvito at Western, who's putting up some great rushing numbers, along the lines with a guy like Jazz Lindsay at Guelph, who, has changed the attitude and swagger of that program and that team. So I think he's making a case to be considered, in the first team, second team, all OUA conversation, first team, second team, all Canadian conversation, and then once the narrative of his program changes and they're being considered a team that's going to win trophies or contend for trophies, then people will start to check his name on their ballots.
I agree completely. And out west this week, there were no games. They have a bye. The whole conference has a bye this week. Next week, get the ball rolling again. Calgary looking to continue to dominate. That's the story for the West. You have Calgary looking to take on, I believe they're just trying to get against Alberta. That's when we were talking about Alberta last week and how they're struggling to get some relevance. Calgary, though, we've always talked about their strength. I'm really interested in seeing if Alberta can show up against Calgary, against a top team this week.
Yeah, the Battle of Alberta hasn't really been much of a battle in the last couple of years. Really since Blake Nill it came to town. And, Calgary, you talk about a team who had a bye, so able to get rested and plays Alberta this week. And, no disrespect to the Bears, but Calgary's going to look at this game like almost another bye, like a controlled scrimmage. And victory for them would be getting out of this game, injury-free, but also getting out of this game assignment correct and being mentally sharp and respecting your opponent and being able to compete. Because, one of the recent struggles for the Can West as a conference is, its representative, Calgary, hasn't really been tested throughout the regular season. And then once they got to the national semifinals, the increase in intensity was just tough for them to adjust to. And when it takes you a quarter and a half to adjust to that increased intensity against elite opponents, it's just a little bit too late. So they got to continue to make sure that they're competing with themselves and not so much their competition. The one that should be a great competition is the other game at that night. CIS fans might be bouncing back and forth online, viewing those games in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and the Manitoba travels to Saskatchewan, and we know how tough it is to play at the University of Saskatchewan. And again, this is a game that has playoff implications as far as seeding goes in the Can West playoffs. So with Regina kind of solidifying themselves as the number 2 team in the Can West, Manitoba and Saskatchewan fighting for that third spot and some seeding, that should be a big one on the 12th.
Yeah, especially those ones. And then Calgary playing Regina on the 19th. So there's four teams playing. Calgary, Alberta, potential trap game, as you mentioned. Teams need to stay sharp. Manitoba, Saskatchewan, 2 teams needing to just fighting with each other. Regina, UBC. Now, I'm pretty sure Regina will be able to handle UBC in that one, as UBC is really injured right now, talking to people out west. So the Can West needing to get strong. Interesting that you say that the competition issue with Calgary, when they enter the next level at Nationals, the only times they seem to go on and go forward is when they play against the AUS. And as you mentioned last week, another conference that struggles with competition.
Yeah, and I think there's 2 different theories, philosophies on what's the best way to garner Vanier Cup championships for a conference. And when you look at the AUS historically and the Can West historically, when they've won their Vaniers, you've had one dominant team that's run through that regular season schedule. In the AUS, it was St. Mary's. In the Can West, at times it was Manitoba, at times it was Saskatchewan, at times it was Calgary. They've run through the schedule, but they've also dominated the recruiting. So they've piled all of the recruiting resources on that program, and they got the best players on that side of the country. Historically, in the OUA and even in Quebec, even though Laval has been the dominant team, you've had really some intensity in the regular season games, and the recruiting has been a wash. Sometimes Laval would dominate recruiting, sometimes it would be Montreal. Sherbrooke has had some great classes in Ontario. McMaster's had the number 1 class in the last couple of years. Western's obviously always there. Queens of late has had some good classes, and Guelph over the last 2 years has had great classes, specifically at the offensive line. And even when you look back to that Laurier team, most of their starters were 4th and 5th year guys when they won the recruiting war 4 and 5 years before they got that far. So it's kind of 2 schools of thought. In the AUS and the Can West, one school that really dominates the recruiting resources, puts together a power team, and hopes that it's good enough to beat the best teams from the rest of the country, where the balance of power as far as recruiting goes in Ontario and Quebec is a little bit more wide, but they feel that the tough schedule that you play in those conferences gets you razor sharp for tough games in November and December, if you make it that far.
Thank you, Donnovan, again for making some time. Happy Thanksgiving, and from Rouge Radio, happy Thanksgiving to all of our listeners. So I'm Kevin Garbuio, speaking with Donnovan Bennett.